So this is the third meeting of the Net Zero Network, and I'm calling it the third meeting, but it's actually kind of part two to the second meeting. The last meeting that we held, which most of you were here for, but a few of you weren't, so I'll describe anyway, was about this question of how do we get involved in the drive towards net zero, the energy transition, creating a decarbonised world, because that's why we're all here, that's what we're all interested in. And we threw out lots of different ideas for what that could look like. But that used up all of our mental energy for the 90 minutes that we were here last time. And so we always knew that we would probably have to split this into a second session to help us really hone in on which of those ideas we want to take forwards into the plan for the Net Zero Network in 2022. So I'd like to thank you all for being here, because frankly, it's actually not the most exciting meeting to come along to. We've got loads of great ideas and inspiring speakers and so on we want to expose you to in the future. But we feel it's really important to work through this process as a group to figure out what it is that we're going, what you want this group and this network to be. So I appreciate you coming along, especially at a very busy time of year as well. One small piece of housekeeping which I forgot. I was going to ask Chris to take a few pictures throughout the evening. Has anyone got any objections to that or wants to? It's useful to have pictures.
Yeah, just go for it, just don't include me.
Not treated.
Yeah, right, not even.
Not
So I just take that one.
Would you like, yeah, right of editing rights. So we're going to talk about what we want to be in 2022. To set the scene, I want to talk a little bit, though, about something which has happened in 2021. It's just an example of the kind of thing which is going on in WA at the moment, which is possible to become involved in. And it's an example which is personal to me, as you'll see when I describe it. But hopefully you can also see how that then leads to a connection to what the NZN might be for us all. So the thing I want to talk about is the thing I want to talk about is the adoption of rooftop solar within Perth. Now, many of you might know this already. The adoption rate for rooftop solar in Australia generally, but particularly in Western Australia and South Australia, is incredible. We're world leading in the adoption rate. So we've got all this renewable energy which is going into the electricity grid every single day, which is not funded by large organisations, it's funded by individuals. And the reason that people are doing this, of course, is not because they necessarily want to do the right thing by the climate, in most cases. It's because the business case is now overwhelmingly strong. If you've got roof space and you've got $5,000 or $10,000 to spare, then this is a really great way to invest your money, and you will find that you will get a return on that investment probably in under 5 years. So a massive success story for the state. But it also creates an enormous challenge. So rooftop solar currently generates about 1,300 megawatts of energy in the middle of the day. And to put that in context, the overall peak load on the Southwest Interconnected System grid, so the grid of Perth and the surrounding areas, is about 4,000 megawatts. So 1,300 megawatts is a massive proportion of that, and it's in fact larger than any other power station. A typical coal-fired power station might be, say, 300 megawatts. Now, what this does is it creates a situation throughout the day where the energy which is provided is very, very variable. So this is a diagram called the duck curve, which many of you might be familiar with already. The x-axis is a 24-hour period, and the y-axis is the operational load on the electricity grid. So if you look back to 2012, that was a reasonably flat line. That's before the widespread adoption of rooftop solar. No little bumps in the morning when we all wake up and put the kettle on, and then in the afternoon when we get home and maybe the aircon goes on and we cook dinner. But it's generally a pretty flat line, and a coal-fired power station or a gas-fired power station can deal with that pretty well. But what the electricity grid is seeing now is a massive dip in that curve in the middle of the day. And that's because we don't need to consume solar power. We don't need to consume energy off the electricity grid anymore because we're getting it from our own solar panels. And what's more, we're actually putting solar power back into the grid as well, deepening that curve even further. So that essentially creates a mismatch in supply and demand. And that's reflected in the pricing for power which is generated at home. So if you sell your solar power in the middle of the day, you'll get 3 cents per kilowatt hour, which isn't very much. If, on the other hand, you need to buy energy later on in the day to do things like run the dishwasher in the evening, that will cost me or my tariff anyway, 26 cents per kilowatt hour. So there's a 23-cent difference. And the obvious thing to ask yourself then is, how can I take all this super cheap renewable electricity from the middle of the day and push it to later on? And of course, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the answer there is batteries. So you can go and you can buy a Tesla Powerwall. A Tesla Powerwall costs, or any other similar kind of battery, would be about the same kind of price, would cost about $13,500 last time I checked. And it will hold about 13.5 kilowatt hours. So for context, the solar system in my house generates about 3.5 kilowatts per hour. So a 13.5 kilowatt hour would be big enough battery to hold all the energy from the day and use it in the evening. So on each of those kilowatts that you're using later on, you're essentially saving 23 cents. Add that up and you get to about $3 per day that having this battery will save you. Which is nice, but $3 a day is going to take a really long time to pay off $13,500. In fact, it takes over 12 years. And the life of a battery is probably, it's not far off that, right? And I think the guaranteed life is normally around 10 years as well. So it basically doesn't take itself. And that's the reason that the level of battery adoption within WA is tiny compared to the adoption of rooftop solar systems. So then you can start thinking about, well, it doesn't work at the small scale, but I am hearing about these grid scale batteries going in now. So if you follow the press, you'll hear about, say, the Hornsdale battery in South Australia, a 100 megawatt battery. How does the business case for those batteries stack up, but it doesn't stack up for my battery at home? And there's a really good study which looks into what the economics of a large-scale battery is by the University of Queensland. It's all online. You can go and look at the information. They did a study by doing, so not a very academic approach. They actually got a 1 megawatt battery and they installed it on one of their campuses. So that cost them $2 million, and it was a 2-hour battery. So its total storage it could store was just over 2 megawatts. So you divide one number by the other, and you get to, again, about $1,000 per kilowatt hour, which is very similar to the Tesla battery, 13.5 kilowatts, $13,500. So one thing that tells you is this isn't about economies of scale. Battery is very, very modular. If you scale them up, the cost scales up accordingly.
The price they announced for that one in Banana was exactly the same. It was about $10,000 per kilowatt hour.
$1,000 per kilowatt hour. Yeah. So it's driven by the cost of cells and so on. And hopefully it will come down over time. Now, the interesting figures in their report were the revenue which it was possible for them to generate. So the first thing that they talk about is arbitrage. So the trial actually only ran for 1 quarter, so I've multiplied these figures up before to get to an annual revenue. But arbitrage is a fancy name for what we just talked about. So buying electricity when it's cheap, selling it when it's more expensive. And they were doing this based on the wholesale market as opposed to a standard tariff like I just talked about. Didn't make them a lot of money. In fact, based on the amount of money that they would get there and the $2 billion it cost them originally, that would be a 60-year payoff, which is not a very good investment any investor would be interested in. But there were other things that they could do with that battery which dramatically increased the amount of revenue which could be generated. So the first one, and by far the largest chunk, was what's called frequency control, and then there was something on top called a virtual cap. And I'll focus on the frequency control because that's the larger element of it, and it's similar in some ways to the virtual cap. Frequency control is all about helping the electricity grid stay within a very, very narrow frequency range. So AC power, in this state, 50 hertz. And the reason that it's 50 hertz is because 50 times a second, somewhere in a power station, something is spinning round and round and round. So it could be a turbine which is powered by a coal steam generator. And what happens if you have a sudden increase on the load in the grid? So imagine that the neck of the duck in the afternoon when the solar's dropping off and we're all putting on our air conditioning systems. Then there's this very rapid ramp up in the load on the grid, and that spinning piece of machinery will actually slow down. So it's having to work harder, it goes more slowly, and the frequency of the grid drops. Now that's a really big problem because a lot of electrical equipment relies on that frequency being 50 hertz. So what you need to solve that problem is rapid injections of energy into the system. And batteries are absolutely fantastic at providing that. So by providing frequency control services to the grid, which there is a market for, this battery is getting paid a lot more than just by buying that normal buying and selling. And the interesting thing about frequency control is you don't even have to provide it to get paid, you just have to be online and ready to provide it. It's in reserve for the grid to draw upon. So you stack those two different forms of revenue together, and then that takes you to a 7-year return on investment for a large-scale battery in this example. And that starts to look like quite an appealing investment all of a sudden for an investor, particularly when you add some green finance and so on top of that. Bring ourselves back now to the scale of your own home. And the traditional grid setup is you have a power station, maybe nowadays a wind farm as well, pumping power into your house. Add some solar, some batteries, and you can sell that back into the grid. But as we've discussed, the return on investment isn't likely to be particularly appealing. But what we can then do is look at how we can combine lots of different individual houses together into what the industry calls a virtual power plant, where you are able not only to provide that arbitrage, that buying and selling of electricity at different times of day, but also to start to provide things like frequency services back to the grid. And that's really, really interesting, because if you can do that, then suddenly people can look at the return on investment of their household battery as a 5-year investment, not a 12-year investment. And you might see the kind of uptake of batteries which you see in solar PV. Now, the reason that I'm particularly interested in this problem is because this is now my day job. So the work that I'm doing at the Australian Energy Market Operator right now is looking at this challenge and how we can create the kind of markets for individuals to participate in so that the return on investment gets better and better for batteries. And in the future, this could get even more exciting because we can start looking at things like how you bring the loads that you have in your home into this equation as well. So how can you automatically control your dishwasher, or your aircon unit, or your pool pump to use power at the right time of day within whatever constraints you set on it? Or even your electric vehicle, which is basically just a battery on wheels, can that participate in the energy markets as well? That will all add value for people to go and invest in these things themselves, and ultimately these investments will help the grid. And the reason I really care about all of that, of course, is once you stabilise the grid with batteries, then you can start turning off those sources of thermal generation, those coal-fired power stations, and start creating lower emissions. So, has anyone seen the latest James Bond?
Yes.
Quite good. Yeah.
Oh,
You
it's
didn't
too
like it? Okay.
emotional. So emotional.
We're going to
Don't tell me. She's giving it away.
Sorry, Steve. I think I sidelined the discussion into a tense discussion about
Well,
which
look, there
James
he
Bond.
is.
Yeah.
He's not the real Bond.
So unfortunately,
That's not your brother. Connery.
You quickly better get back to
yeah, I better get back
Better
to
get
I was
back to
unable to persuade Daniel Craig to become a member of the NZN, but I do kind of feel like in doing the work that I'm doing now at the Australian Energy Market Operator, I'm kind of a bit, undercover, even if I don't get to wear the DJ, because I am there working as a AEMO project manager on this challenge, and really the state aims the organisation about the security of the electricity system and about the affordability of electricity. There is no clearly stated aim around sustainability and turning off coal-fired power stations, but it's perfectly possible for me to do a good job at that, and in the process achieve the objectives that I have and which I'm sharing with the NZN as well. But the difference here, there are many differences between me and James Bond, unfortunately, but one of them is that this isn't something that I want to keep secret. This is something that I want to talk to people about and help maybe identify other opportunities where I can do other similar things in the future, or I can help people get involved in some other way. So I want to inform. And I think that's what we're talking about here. It's one of the key things that really came out of the presentation, the workshop that we did last time, was people want to be informed about what's going on, what the opportunities are. And we want to empower, so we want to give people the knowledge and the connection so that they can go and act on their desires to create the kind of change that they're interested in. So when I think about the why of why we're doing that, it's pretty simple really. We want to deliver a planet which is actually somewhere which is worth living on for future generations. So as I mentioned before, what we did in the last meeting is that we went very broad in coming up with lots of different ideas. Steve took us through a really great structured process for doing that. And this meeting is then about zooming back into what we want this group to look like in 2022. And I think there are a lot of good ideas which have already been generated, and I'm confident, Steve, that you're going to take us through a strong process which will help us hone in so that we can hit the ground running in 2022. For me, I feel like with the example that I just gave, that is only just getting started. This whole market for energy and electricity, which we generate in our homes, is going to be huge in future. And there are so many other examples like that as well. So we're really just at exactly the right time to do this if we want to be part of something big over the next year. Steve, would you like to talk about the process that we're going to run through next?
Yeah, okay. So the first thing we're going to do, has anyone seen these posts